to start my second job. So, trying to put this out before I leave. Today we're going to talk about Prohibition. The Prohibition era was the period from 1920 to 1933 when the United States prohibited the production, importation, transportation, and sale of alcohol beverages. Um, the alcohol industry was curtailed by a succession of state legislators, and Prohibition was formally introduced nationwide under the 18th Amendment to the United States, and it was ratified on January 16th of 1919. Prohibition ended with the ratification of the 21st Amendment, which would repeal the 18th Amendment on December 5th of 1933. You got some couple photos here to look at. Top here is a Michigan and Detroit policeman inspecting equipment used in a clandestine brewery that was used in a bust. And then down here is every day will be Sunday when the town goes dry. So, a wide coalition of mostly Protestants, prohibitionists, first attempted to end the trade in alcoholic drinks during the 19th century, and they aimed to heal what they saw as an ill society beset by alcohol-related problems, such as alcoholism. Yes, that's another thing too. So they attempted to end the trade in alcoholic drinks during the 19th century, and they aimed to heal what they saw as an ill society beset by alcoholic problems, domestic violence, and saloon-based political corruption. Many communities introduced alcohol bans in the state in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and the enforcement of these new prohibition laws became a topic for debate. Prohibition supporters that were called Dries presented it as a battle for public morals and health, and the movement was taken up by progressives in the Prohibition Democratic and Republican parties. And they gained a national grassroots base through the Women's Christian Temperance Union. After 1900, it was coordinated by the Anti-Saloon League. Opposition from the beer industry mobilized wet supporters from the wealthy Catholic and German Lutheran communities, but the influence of these groups receded from 1917 following the entry of the U.S. into the First World War against Germany. Now, the 18th Amendment that was passed in 1919 with the 68% supermajority in the House of Representatives and 76% support in the Senate, and it was ratified by 46 out of 48 states. Enabling legislation known as the Volstead Act set down the rules for enforcing the federal ban and defined the types of alcoholic beverages that were prohibited. Now, not all alcohol was banned. For example, religious use of wine was permitted, which you could have wine in a church setting, but private ownership and consumption of alcohol were not made illegal under federal law, but local now private ownership and consumption of, like I said, of alcohol were not made illegal under federal law, but local laws were stricter in many areas, and some states would ban possession outright. Now, by the late 1920s, a new opposition to prohibition emerged nationwide. The opposition attacked the policy, claiming that it lowered tax revenue at a critical time before and during the Great Depression. Now, and it imposed rural Protestant religious values on urban America. Now, the 21st Amendment ended prohibition, although it continued in some states, and to this date, this is the only time in American history in which a constitutional amendment was passed for the purpose of repealing another. Now, the overall effects of prohibition on the society are disputed and hard to pin down. Like some research indicates that alcohol consumption declined substantially due to prohibition, while other research indicates that prohibition did not reduce alcohol consumption in the long term, but Americans who wanted to continue drinking alcohol found loopholes in prohibition laws, or they used illegal methods to get their hands on it, resulting in the emergence of black market and crime syndicates dedicated to distributing alcohol. By contrast, rates of liver cirrhosis, alcoholic psychosis, and infant mortality declined during Prohibition, and because of the lack of uniform national statistics gathered about crime prior to 1930, it's difficult to draw conclusions about how Prohibition's effect on crime at the national. Now, support for Prohibition diminished steadily throughout its duration, including among former supporters of Prohibition. Here's a pro-prohibition political cartoon with a woman riding on a horse, and you see all the alcohol barrels. So on November 18th of 1918, prior to ratification of the 18th Amendment, Congress passed the Temporary Wartime Prohibition Act, which banned the sale of alcoholic beverages having an alcohol content that was greater than 1.28. This act, which had been intended to save grain for the war effort, was passed 10 days after the armistice ending World War I was signed. Which was signed on November 21st of 1918. The Wartime Prohibition Act took effect on June 30th of 1919, with July 1st becoming known as the Thirsty First. Now, the U.S. Senate proposed the 18th Amendment on December 18th of 1917 upon being approved by the 36 states on January 16th of 1919. The amendment was ratified as part of the Constitution, but by the terms of the amendment, the country went dry 1 year later on January 17th of 1920. On October 28th of 1919, Congress passed the Volstead Act, the popular name for the National Prohibition Act, over President Woodrow Wilson's veto. The act established the legal definition of intoxicating liquors as well as penalties for producing them. Now, although the Volstead Act prohibited the sale of alcohol, the federal government lacked resources to enforce it. Now, Prohibition was successful in reducing the amount of liquor consumed. Cirrhosis, death rates, admissions to state mental hospitals for alcoholic psychosis, arrests for public drunkenness, and rates of absenteeism. Now, while many state that Prohibition stimulated the proliferation of rampant, underground, organized, and widespread criminal activity, Kenneth G. Rose and George Frank Pincard make the opposite claim, that there was no increase in crime during the Prohibition era, and that such claims are rooted in the impressionistic rather than the factual. Now, the highest homicide rate in the United States in the first half of the 20th century occurred during the years of the Prohibition, decreasing immediately after Prohibition ended. By 1925, there were anywhere from 30,000 to 100,000 speakeasy clubs in New York City alone. Now, what opposition talked of personal liberty, new tax revenues from legal beer and liquor, and the scourge of organized crime? Now, on March 22nd of 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt signed into law the Coleman-Harrison Act, legalizing beer with an alcohol content of 3.2% by weight, and wine of similarly low alcohol content. On December 5th, ratification of the 21st Amendment repealed the 18th Amendment. However, United States federal law still prohibits the manufacture of distilled spirits without meeting numerous licensing requirements that make it impractical to produce spirits for personal use. Now, consumption of alcohol beverages has been a contentious topic in America since the colonial period. Now, on March 26th of 1636, the legislature of New Somersetshire met at what is now Saco, Maine, and adopted a law limiting the sale of strong liquor or wine, although carving out exceptions for lodgers and allowing serving to laborers on working days for one hour at dinner. In May of 1657, the General Court of Massachusetts made the sale of strong liquor, whether known by the name of rum, strong waters, wine, strong beer, brandy, cider, or puri, or any other strong liquors to the Native Americans illegal. And here's another picture. This is the drunkard's progress. Moderate drinking leads to drunkenness and disaster. This is a lithograph by Nathaniel Currier supporting the temperance movement back in 1846. In general, informal social controls in the house and community helped maintain the exception that the abuse of alcohol was not unacceptable, but drunkenness was condemned and punished, but only as an abuse of a God-given gift. Now, drinking alcohol itself was not looked upon as culpable any more than food deserved blame for the sin of gluttony. Excess was a personal indiscretion. When informal controls failed, there were legal replications and legal options. Now, shortly after the United States obtained independence, the Whiskey Rebellion took place in western Pennsylvania in protest of government-imposed laws on whiskey. where the government imposed taxes on whiskey, although the taxes were primarily levied to help pay down the newly formed national debt. It also received support from some social reformers who hoped a sin tax would raise public awareness about the harmful effects of alcohol. Now, the whiskey tax was repealed after Thomas Jefferson's Democratic Republican Party, which would oppose the Federalist Party of Alexander Hamilton when he came to power in 1800. Now, Benjamin Rush, one of the foremost physicians of the late 18th century, believed in moderation rather than prohibition. In his treatise, The Inquiry into the Effects of Ardent Spirits upon the Human Body and Mind of 1784, Rush would argue that the excessive use of alcohol was injurious to physical and psychological health, labeling drunkenness as a disease apparently influenced by Rush's widely discussed belief. About 200 farmers in a Connecticut community formed a temperance association in 1789. Similar associations were formed in Virginia in 1800 and New York in 1808. Within a decade, other temperance groups had formed in 8 states, some of them being statewide organizations. The words of Rush and other early temperance reformers served to dichotomize the use of alcohol for men and women. So while men enjoyed drinking and often considered it vital to their health, women who began to embrace the ideology of true motherhood would refrain from the consumption of alcohol so that their kids wouldn't get them. Today is talking about prohibition. Now, middle-class women who were considered the moral authorities of their households consequently would reject the drinking of alcohol, which they believed to be a threat to the home. Now, in 1830, on average, Americans consumed about 1.7 bottles of hard liquor per week, 3 times the amount consumed in 2010. The American... I've never really tried. I never really tried the chartreuse or whatever it's called. So the American Temperance Society, known as ATS, formed in 1826, helped initiate the first temperance movement and served as a foundation for many later groups. Now, by 1835, the ATS had reached 1.5 million members, with women constituting 35 to 60% of its chapters. The Prohibition movement, also known as the Dry Crusade, continued up until the 1840s, and it was spearheaded by a range of Protestant denominations, especially the Methodists, Baptists, and the Salvation Army. The late 19th century saw the temperance movement broaden its focus from abstinence to include all behavior and institutions related to alcohol consumption. Preachers such as Reverend Mark A. Matthews linked liquor dispensing saloons with political corruption. Well, but particularly in my town, it's actually earlier, because it's 9:39 where I'm at. So yeah, it is a little bit earlier for me. Now, some successes for the movement were achieved in the 1850s, including the Maine Law, adopted in 1851. Now, I know who Ken Burns is, but no, I have not seen his Prohibition documentary. I'm pretty sure I can find that on YouTube. So some successes for the movement were achieved in the 1850s, including the Maine Law, which was adopted, Prohibition, the banning of alcohol, which happened back in the 1900s, and then the ban of alcohol is the only amendment to be repealed today. They repealed it in 1933, making it legal to sell, but from 1919 to 1933, it was illegal to have your hands on the alcohol. Now, some successes for the movement were achieved in the 1850s, including the Maine Law, which was adopted in 1851, and then which banned the manufacture and sale of liquor. Now, before its repeal in 1856, 12 states followed the example that was set by Maine in total prohibition. The temperance movement was lost strength and was marginalized during the American Civil War, which went on from 1861 to 1865. Following the war, social moralists turned to other issues, such as Mormon polygamy and the temperance movement. And up here, you have a 1902 illustration from the Hawaiian Gazette newspaper, humorously illustrates the Anti-Saloon League and the Women's Christian Temperance Union's campaign against the producers and sellers of beers in Hawaii, and the water cure was considered to be a torture device. The Dry Crusade was revived by the National Prohibition Party, founded in 1869, and the Women's Christian Temperance Union, known as WCTU, which was founded in 1874. The WCTU they advocated the prohibition of alcohol as a method for preventing, through education, and abuse of alcoholic husbands. WCTU members believed that if their organization could reach children with its message, it could create. They considered it to be a sin. When alcohol first came out, they considered it to be a sin, and they believed that if you drank alcohol, you would become violent and abusive, and that's why they had banned it. Now, you can get your hands on alcohol now because now it's not illegal to do so. WCTU members believed that if their organization could reach children with its message, it could create a dry sentiment leading to prohibition. Francis Willard, the second president of the WCTU, held that the aims of the organization were to create a union of women from all denominations for the purpose of educating the young and forming a better public sentiment, reforming the drinking classes, transforming by the power of divine grace of those who were enslaved by alcohol, and removing the dram shop from the streets by law. Now, while still denied universal voting privileges, women in the WCTU followed Francis Willard's do everything doctrine and used temperance as a method of entering into politics and furthering other progressive issues, as such as prison reform and labor laws. No, I've never heard of that one. I've had Max Hard Lemonade, and I've had Corona, and I've had vodka. So I'm like, so those ones I've had, 1881, Kansas became the first state to outlaw alcoholic beverages in its constitution. Arrested over 30 times and fined and jailed on multiple occasions, prohibitionist activist Carrie Nation attempted to enforce the state's ban on alcohol consumption. She would walk into saloons, scolding customers, and used her hatchet to destroy bottles of liquor. Nation recruited ladies into the Carrie Nation Prohibition group, which she would also be the leader of. While Nation's vigilante techniques were rare, other activists enforced the dry calls by entering saloons, singing, praying, and urging saloon keepers to stop selling alcohol. Now, dry states, especially those in the South, enacted prohibition legislation, as did individual counties within the state. Now, court cases also debated the subject of prohibition, while some cases ruled in opposition. The general tendency was toward support. In Mugler versus Kansas, 1887. I've never had Guinness, but I had Jack Daniel's whiskey. Whiskey is pretty strong. Now, Justice Harlan commented, "We cannot shut out of view the fact within the knowledge of all that the public health, the public morals, and the public safety may be endangered by the general use of intoxicating drinks, nor the fact established by statistics accessible to everyone, that the idleness disorder, pauperism, and crime existing in the country are in some degree traceable to this evil." In support of prohibition, Crawley vs. Christensen, 1890, remarked, "The statistics of every state show a greater amount of crime and misery attributable to the use of ardent spirits obtained at these retail liquor saloons rather than to any other source." Now, the proliferation of neighborhood saloons in the post-Civil War era became a phenomenon of an increasingly industrialized urban working men's bars. Working men's bars were popular in social gathering places from the workplace and home life. The brewing industry was actively involved in establishing saloons as a lucrative consumer base in their business chain. Saloons were more often than not linked to specific brewery, where the salon keeper's operation was financed by a brewer and contractually obligated to sell the brewer's product to the exclusion of competing brands. A saloon's business model often included the offer of a free lunch, where the bill of a fare come out of a fare commonly consisted of heavily salted food, meant to induce the thirst and the purchase of drink. Now, during the Progressive Era, which ran from 1890 to 1920, hostility toward saloons and their political influence became widespread, with the Anti-Saloon League superseding the Prohibition Party and the Women's Christian Temperance Union as the most influential advocate of prohibition. After these latter two groups expanded their efforts to support the other social reform issues, such as women's suffrage, onto the prohibition platform. Now, prohibition became an important force in state and local politics from the 1840s to 1930s, and numerous historical studies demonstrated that the political forces involved were ethno-religious. Now, prohibition was supported by the Dries, primarily P-stick evangelical Protestant denominations, which would include Methodists, Northern Baptists, Southern Baptists, New School Protestants, Disciples of Christ, which is Mormon, Congregational Quakers, and Scandinavian Lutherans. But this would also include the Catholic Total Abstinence Union of America, and to a certain extent the Mormon religion. Now, these religious groups identified saloons as politically corrupt and drinking as a personal sin. Secular dry organizations were led by the powerful Anti-Saloon League and the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Okay, so you had two groups called the Dries and the Wets. The dry people were against the sale of alcohol, and then you had wet people who believed that alcohol should be legalized. So those two were like things like that. And we still have dry counties. Yes. That would be the main reasoning. The main reasoning is, yes, on religious grounds. Now the dry prohibition crusade was opposed by the Wets, led by little ritualistic Protestants, Episcopalians, and German Lutherans and Catholics. They denounced the idea that the government should define morality. Even in the wet stronghold of New York City, there was an active prohibition movement led by Norwegian church groups and African American labor activists who believed that prohibition would benefit workers, especially the African Americans. Tea merchants and soda fountain manufacturers generally supported prohibition, believing that banning alcohol would increase sales of their products. Yeah, back in the 1800s, it might have been. Now, back in the 1800s, when Coca-Cola first started, I remember reading the story that they actually would put the drug cocaine in Coca-Cola as one of the ingredients. But they don't do that no more. A particularly effective operator. Hold on, I think I might. No, okay, I'm right here. Now, yeah, a particularly effective operator on the political fronts was Wayne Wheeler of the Anti-Saloon League, who made prohibition a wedge issue and succeeded in getting many prohibition candidates elected. Coming from Ohio, his deep resentment for alcohol started at a young age. He was injured on a farm by a worker who had been drunk. Now, this event transformed Wheeler. Starting low in the ranks, he quickly moved up due to his deep-rooted hatred of alcohol, but he later realized to further the movement he would need more public approval and fast. Now, this was the start of his policy called Wheelerism, where he used the media to make it seem like the general public was in on a specific issue, and Wheeler became known as Dry Boss because of his influence and power. Now here, you have a picture of a governor, James P. Goodrich, who signs the Indiana Prohibition Act into effect in 1917. That's when they started trying to ban alcohol. Prohibition represented a conflict between urban and rural version in the United States. Now, given the mass influx of migrants to the urban centers of the United States, many individuals within the Prohibition movement associated the crime and morally corrupt behavior of American cities with their large immigration populations. Now, saloons frequented by immigrants in these cities were often frequented by politicians who wanted to obtain the immigrants' votes in exchange for favors such as job offers, legal assistance, and food baskets. Now, thus, saloons were seen as a breeding ground for political corruption. Now, most economists during the early 20th century were in favor of the enactment of the 18th Amendment prohibition. Simon Patton, one of the leading advocates for prohibition, predicted that prohibition would eventually happen in the United States for competitive and evolutionary reasons. Now, Yale economics professor Irving Fisher, who was a dry, which he was against alcohol, wrote extensively about prohibition, including a paper that made an economic case for prohibition. Now, Fisher is credited. Oh yeah, it kind of does. Now, Fisher is credited with supplying the criteria against which future prohibitions, such as against marijuana, could be measured in terms of crime, health, and productivity. Now, I'm actually, when they legalized marijuana, I was actually glad they did, because marijuana is the only drug that I know of where you can get high, but you don't do stupid shit. Except for just talking to my wall for 6 hours. That's what I did the first time I smoked it. Now, in terms of crime, health, and productivity, for example, Blue Monday referred to the hangover workers experienced after a weekend of binge drinking. I've never done any binge drinking, but resulting in Mondays being a wasted a productive day. New research has discredited Fisher's research, which was based on uncontrolled experiments. Regardless, his $6 billion figure for the annual gains of prohibition in the United States continues to be cited to this day. Now, in a backlash to the emerging reality of a changing American demographic, many prohibitionists subscribe to the doctrine of nativism, in which they endorse the notion that the success of America was the result of its white Anglo-Saxon ancestry. Now, this belief fostered distrust of immigrant communities that had fostered saloons and incorporated drinking in their popular culture. Now, the other amendments to the Constitution were championed by dry crusaders to help their case. One was granted in the 16th Amendment of 1913, which replaced alcoholic taxes that funded the federal government within a federal income tax. The other was women's suffrage, which was granted after the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Since women tended to support prohibition, temperance organizations tended to support women's suffrage. Now, in the presidential election of 1916, the Democratic incumbent Woodrow Wilson and the Republican candidate Charles Hughes ignored the prohibition issue, such as did both parties' political platforms. Democrats and Republicans had strong wet and dry factions, and the election was expected to be close, with neither candidate wanting to alienate any part of their political base. Now, here's a 1915 political cartoon. This is a 1915 political cartoon criticizing the alliance between the prohibitionists and women's suffrage movements, showing gently of intolerance, labeled prohibition emerging from the bottle. I like some of these old pictures. They're kind of cool. Now, when the 65th Congress convened in March of 1917, the Dries outnumbered the Wets by 140 to 64 in the Democratic Party and 138 to 62 among Republicans. With America's declaration of war against people, German Americans, a major force against prohibition, were sidelined, and their protests subsequently ignored. In addition, a new justification for prohibition arose, prohibiting the production of alcoholic beverages, and it would allow more resources, especially grain that would otherwise be used to make alcohol, to be devoted to the war effort. Now, while wartime prohibition was a spark for the movement, World War I ended before nationwide prohibition was enacted anyway. A resolution calling for a constitutional amendment to accomplish nationwide prohibition was introduced in Congress and passed by both houses on December 17th, on December of 1917. By January 16th of 1919, the amendment had been ratified by 36 out of the 48 states, making it law. Eventually, only two states, Connecticut and Rhode Island, opted out of ratifying it. So on October 28th of 1919, Congress would pass enabling legislation known as the Volstead Act to enforce the 18th Amendment when it went into effect in 1920. Now, Prohibition would begin on January 17th of 1920 when the Volstead Act went into effect. A total of 1,520 federal prohibition agents, police, were tasked with enforcing this. Now, supporters of the amendment soon became confident that it would not be repealed, but one of its creators, Senator Morris Shepherd, joked that there is as much chance of repealing the 18th Amendment as there is for a hummingbird to fly to the planet Mars with the Washington Monument tied to its tail. At the same time, songs emerged decrying the act after Edward, Prince of Wales, returned to the United Kingdom following his tour of Canada in 1919. He recounted to his father, King George V, a ditty that he had heard at a border town. Now, I'm not sure what some of this means, but you know. So 4 and 20 Yankees. So 4 and 20. I think that means 420. I think, but feeling very dry, they went across the border to get a drink of rye. When the rye was opened, the Yankees began to sing "God Bless America," but God Save the King. So right up here, you got this. And so at the top here, after the 36th state adopted the amendment on January 16th of 1919, the U.S. Secretary of State had to issue a formal proclamation declaring its ratification. Implementing and enforcement bills had to be presented to Congress and the state legislature to be enacted before the amendment's effective date 1 year. Oh, go back here. Shit. Okay, yeah, right here. This is a Budweiser ad from 1919 announcing the reformulation of its flagship beer as required under the Act, ready for sale by 1920. Now, when Prohibition became enacted in 1919, Prohibition became highly controversial among medical professionals because alcohol was widely prescribed by the era's physicians for therapeutic purposes. Congress held hearings on the medical value of beer in 1921. Subsequently, physicians across the country lobbied for the repeal of Prohibition as it applied to medicinal liquors. From 1921 to 1930, doctors earned about $40 million for whiskey prescriptions, while the manufacturers, importation, sale, and transport of alcohol was illegal in the United States. Section 29 of the Volstead Act allowed wine and cider to be made from fruit at home, but not beer. So every year, about up to 200 gallons of wine and cider were made per year, and some vineyards grew grapes for home use. Now, the act did not prohibit the consumption of alcohol, but many people stockpiled wines and liquors for their personal use in the latter part of 1919 before sales of alcoholic beverages became illegal in January. And that was back in 1920. Now, since alcohol was illegal in neighboring countries, distilleries and breweries in Canada, Mexico, and the Caribbean flourished as their products were either consumed by visiting Americans or they were smuggled into the United States illegally. Now, one of these rivers, the Detroit River, which forms part of the U.S. border with Canada, was notoriously difficult to control, especially rum running in Windsor, Canada. Now, when the U.S. government complained to Britain and that prohibition was being undermined by officials in Nassau, the Bahamas, the head of the colonial office refused to intervene. Winston Churchill believed that prohibition was an affront to the whole history of mankind in general. Three federal agencies were assigned the task of enforcing the Volstead Act: the U.S. Coast Guard Office of Law Enforcement, the U.S. Treasury's IRS Bureau of Prohibition, and the U.S. Department of Justice Bureau of Prohibition. Now, as early as 1925, journalist H.L. Mencken believed. Okay, so as early as 1925, journalist H.L. Mencken believed that Prohibition was not working. Historian David Olshinsky, summarizing the work of Daniel Arendt, wrote that Prohibition worked best when directed at its primary target, the working class poor. Now, historian Elizabeth Cohen writes, a rich family could have a cellar full of liquor and get by, but if a poor family had one bottle of home brew, there would be trouble. Working class people were inflamed by the act that their employees could dip into a private cash, while the employees, could not. Now, within a week after Prohibition went into effect, small portable stills were on sale throughout the country. Now, here's a picture of a policeman with a wrecked automobile where they confiscated moonshine back in 1922. Now, moonshine is alcohol, but if not made properly, it could cause you to go blind. I'm not sure why. Before the 18th Amendment went into effect in January of 1920, many people of the upper class stockpiled alcohol for legal home consumption after the Prohibition began. They bought the inventories of liquor retailers and wholesalers and emptying out their warehouses, saloons, and club storerooms. President Woodrow Wilson moved his own supply of alcoholic beverages to his Washington residence after his term of office ended, but his successor, Warren G. Harding, relocated his own large supply to the White House. After the 18th Amendment became law, bootlegging became widespread. In the first 6 months of 1920, the federal government opened 7,291 cases for the Volstead Act violations. In the first complete fiscal year, 1921, the number of cases violating the Volstead Act jumped to 29,114 violations, and it would rise dramatically over the next 13 years. Here's a group of people dumping out liquor during Prohibition. They were dumping out the barrel. Now, grape juice was not restricted by the Prohibition, even though if it was allowed to sit for 60 days, it would ferment and turn to wine with a 12% alcohol content. Many people took advantage of this, as a grape juice output quadrupled during the Prohibition era. Now, to prevent bootleggers from using industrial ethyl alcohol to produce illegal beverages, the federal government ordered the denaturation of industrial alcohols, meaning that they must include additives to make them unpalatable or poisonous. In response, bootleggers hired chemists who successfully removed the additives from the alcohol to make it drinkable. As a response, the Treasury Department required manufacturers to add more deadly poisons, including the particularly deadly combination referred to incorrectly as methyl alcohol, 4 parts methanol, 2.25 parts pyridine base, and 0.5 parts benzene per 100 parts ethyl alcohol. Now, New York City medical examiners prominently opposed these policies because of the danger to human life. As many as 10,000 people died from drinking denatured alcohol before Prohibition ended. New York City medical examiner Charles Norris believed that the government took responsibility for murder when they knew the poison was not deterring consumption, and they continued to poison industrial alcohol, which would be used in drinking alcohol anyway. Now, Norris remarked, "The government knows it is not stopping drinking by putting poison in alcohol, yet it continues its poisoning process, heedless of the fact that people determined to drink are daily absorbing that poison. Knowing this is to be true, the United States government must be charged with the moral responsibility for the deaths that poisoned liquor causes, although it cannot be held legally responsible." Another illegal substance that was often substituted for alcohol was sterno, a denatured form of ethyl alcohol and adulterated with methanol and a gelling agent, commonly known as canned heat. Forcing the substance through a makeshift filter, such as a handkerchief, created a rough liquor substitute. However, the result was poisonous, although not often lethal. Now, here's a newsreel from 1933, and it talks about the end of the Prohibition. Now you go to the left here. Orange County, California, sheriff's deputies dumping illegal alcohol back in 1932 before they repealed it. Now, making alcohol at home was common among some families with wet sympathies during Prohibition. Stores sold grape concentrate with warning labels that listed the steps that should be avoided to prevent the juice from fermenting into wine. Now, some drugstores sold medicinal wine with around a 22% alcohol content. Now, in order to justify the sale, the wine was given a medicinal taste. Home distilled hard liquor was called bathtub gin in northern cities, and moonshine in rural areas of Virginia, Kentucky, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, West Virginia, and Tennessee. Making drinkable hard liquor was easier than home brewing good beer. Since selling privately distilled alcohol was illegal and bypassed government taxation, law enforcement officers relentlessly pursued manufacturers in response. Bootleggers modified their cars and trucks by enhancing the engines and suspensions to make faster vehicles that would improve their chances of outrunning and escaping agents of the Bureau of Prohibition. Commonly called revenue agents or revenuers, these cars became known as moonshine runners or shine runners. Shops with wet sympathies were also known to participate in the black liquor market by loading their stocks with ingredients for liquors, including Benedictine, vermouth, Scotch mash, and even ethyl alcohol. Anyone could purchase these ingredients legally. In October of 1930, just 2 weeks before the congressional midterm elections, bootlegger George Cassidy, the man in the green hat, came forward and told members of Congress how he had bootlegged for 10 years. And one of the few bootleggers ever to tell his story, Cassidy wrote five front page articles for the Washington Post in which he estimated that 80% of congressmen and senators drank. The Democrats in the North were mostly wets, and in the 1932 election, they made major gains. The Wets argued that prohibition was not stopping crime and was actually causing the creation of a larger scale, well-funded, and well-armed criminal syndicates. As prohibition became increasingly unpopular, especially in urban areas, its repeal was eagerly anticipated. Wets had the organization and the initiative, and they pushed the argument that states and localities needed to tax money. President Herbert Hoover proposed a new constitutional amendment that was vague on particulars, and it satisfied neither side. Now, Franklin Roosevelt's Democratic platform promised to repeal the 18th Amendment. When Prohibition was repealed in 1933, many bootleggers and suppliers with wet sympathies simply moved into the legitimate liquor business. Some crime syndicates moved their efforts into expanding their protection rackets to cover legal liquor sales and other business areas. Now, you go to the right over here, and you see, and this was what a prescription for a Prohibition era prescription used by U.S. physicians to prescribe liquor as medicine. And that's what the prescription thing looked like what they call prescription pads. Now, doctors were able to prescribe medicinal alcohol for their patients. After just 6 months of prohibition, over 15,000 doctors and 57,000 pharmacists received licenses to prescribe or sell medicinal alcohol, according to Gastro Obscura. Now, physicians wrote an estimated 11 million prescriptions a year throughout the 1920s, and Prohibition Commissioner John F. Kramer even cited one doctor who wrote 475 prescriptions for whiskey in one day. It wasn't tough for people to write and fill counterfeit prescriptions at pharmacies either, but naturally bootleggers brought prescription forms from crooked doctors and mounted widespread scams. In 1931, 400 pharmacists and 1,000 doctors were caught in a scam where doctors sold signed prescription forms to bootleggers. Just 12 doctors and 13 pharmacists were indicted on this, and the ones charged they would face a one-time $50 fine. Selling alcohol through drugstores became so much of a lucrative open secret that its name checked in works such as The Great Gatsby. Historians speculate that Charles R. Walgreen of Walgreens fame expanded from 20 stores to a staggering 525. And they branched from 20 stores to a staggering 525 during the 1920s, thanks to medicinal alcohol sales where people were buying it. Now, some states like Maryland and New York refused to enforce the federal Prohibition Amendment. Enforcement of the law under the 18th Amendment lacked a centralized authority. Clergymen who were sometimes called upon to form vigilante groups to assist in the enforcement of Prohibition. Now, furthermore, American geography contributed to the difficulties in enforcing Prohibition. The buried terrain of valleys, mountains, lakes, and swamps, as well as extensive seaways, ports, and borders. I don't know. By putting in the 18th Amendment, which was the prohibition for banning alcohol in general. Now, clergymen were sometimes called upon to form vigilante groups to assist in the enforcement of prohibition. Now, furthermore, American geography, and then you had the varied terrains of valleys, mountains, lakes, and swamps, as well as the extensive seaways, ports, and borders that the United States shared with Canada and Mexico, and they made it exceedingly difficult for prohibition agents to stop bootlickers given their lack of resources. Now, ultimately, it was recognized with its repeal that the means by which the law was to be enforced were not pragmatic, but in many cases the legislature did not match the general public opinion. Here's a political cartoon. The Defender of the 18th Amendment, Forum of Klansmen Guardians of Liberty, published by the Pillar of Fire Tree. This is the KKK political cartoon. Now in Cicero, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago, the prevalence of ethnic communities who had wet sympathies allowed prominent gang leader Al Capone to operate despite the presence of police being around. Now, the Ku Klux Klan talked a great deal about denouncing bootleggers, and they threatened private vigilante action against known offenders. But despite its large membership in the mid-1920s, it was poorly organized and seldom had an effect. After 1925, the KKK helped disparage any enforcement of prohibition. Now, prohibition created a black market that would compete with the formal economy, and it came under pressure when the Great Depression struck in 1929. State governments urgently needed tax revenue and alcohol sales that the alcohol sales had generated. Now, Franklin Roosevelt when Franklin Roosevelt was elected to his first term in 1932, based in part on his promise to end prohibition, which influenced his support for ratifying the 21st Amendment to repeal prohibition. Now, Naval Captain William H. Slayton was a prominent figure in the anti-prohibition fight. And he founded the Association Against the Prohibition Amendment in 1918. The AAPA was the largest of the nearly 40 organizations that fought to end prohibition. Economic urgency played a large part in accelerating the advocacy for repeal. The number of conservatives who pushed for prohibition in the beginning decreased. Many farmers who fought for prohibition now fought for repeal because of the negative effects it had on the agriculture business. Now, back in 1933, when prohibition ended, here's a picture of people celebrating the ending of prohibition. Now, prior to the 1920 implementation of the Volstead Act, approximately 14% of federal, state, and local tax revenues were derived from alcohol commerce. When the Great Depression hit and tax revenues plunged, the governments needed this revenue stream. Millions could be made by taxing beer, but there was controversy on whether the repeal should be a state or a nationwide decision. On March 22nd of 1933, and Franklin Roosevelt for his first term as president, he was signed an amendment to the Volstead Act, which would be known as the Colin-Harrison Act, and it allowed for the manufacturing and sale of alcohol with a 3.2% alcohol content by weight, approximately 4% alcohol by volume. and light wines. The Volstead Act previously defined an intoxicating beverage as one with greater than 0.5% alcohol. Upon signing the Colin-Harrison Act, Franklin Roosevelt would remark, "I think this would be a good time for a beer." According to a 2017 study in the journal Public Choice, representatives from traditional beer-producing states as well as Democratic politicians were most in favor of this bill, but politicians from many southern states were mostly still strongly opposed to this legislation. Now, the 18th Amendment was repealed on December 5th of 1933. With the ratification of the 21st Amendment to the United States Constitution, despite the efforts of Herbert J. Grant, who was president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which is Mormons. The 21 Utah members of the Constitutional Convention voted unanimously on that day to ratify the 21st Amendment, making Utah the 36th state to do so, and putting the repeal of the 18th Amendment over the top and needed voting. Now, in the late 1930s, after its repeal, 2/5 of the Americans wished to reinstate national prohibition, but they didn't. Now, the post-21st Amendment does not prevent states from restricting or banning alcohol, but instead it prohibits the transportation or importation of alcohol into any state, territory, or possession of the United States. In violation of the laws thereof, thus allowing state and local control of alcohol, there are still numerous dry counties and municipalities in the United States that restrict or prohibit any liquor sales. Now here you have an animated map of alcohol prohibition in the United States. The red states right here are where alcohol is banned, and the blue states are the ones where alcohol was legal to sell. And yellow is moist counties in the United States as of March 2020. Moist, I think, is dry, along with the red. I think, I don't know. I'm not sure how to explain that one. Additionally, many tribal governments prohibit alcohol on Indian reservation grounds. Now, federal law also prohibits alcohol on Indian reservations, although this law is currently only enforced when there's a concomitant violation of local tribal liquor laws. After its repeal, some former supporters openly admitted failure. For example, John D. Rockefeller Jr. explained his view in a letter that he wrote in 1932. When Prohibition was introduced, he hoped that it would be widely supported by public opinion, and the day would soon come when the evil effects of alcohol would be recognized. I have slowly and reluctantly come to believe that this has not been the result, but instead drinking has generally increased. The speakeasy has replaced the saloon, a vast army of lawbreakers has appeared, and many of our best citizens have openly ignored prohibition. And respect for the law has been greatly lessened, and crime has increased to a level that many have never seen. Now, some historians claim that alcohol consumption in the United States did not exceed the pre-prohibition levels until the 1960s. Now, others claim that alcohol consumption reached the pre-prohibition levels several years after its enactment and has continued to rise. Cirrhosis of the liver, a symptom of alcoholism, declined nearly 2/3 during Prohibition. In the decades after Prohibition, any stigma that had been associated with alcohol consumption was erased, according to a Gallup poll survey conducted almost every year since 1939, and 2/3 of the American adults age 18 and older drink alcohol. Now, technically, you got to be 21 and older now to drink alcohol. Shortly after World War II, a national opinion survey found that found that about 1/3 of the people in the United States favor national prohibition. Upon repeal of national prohibition, 18 states continued prohibition at the state level, but the last state, Mississippi, finally ended in 1966. Almost 2/3 of all states adopted some form of local option, which enabled residents and political subdivisions to vote for or against political prohibition. Now, therefore, despite the repeal of prohibition at the national level, 38% of the nation's population lived in areas with state or local prohibition laws. In 2014, a nationwide poll found that 81% of Americans thought that the use of alcohol should be legal, while only 18% were against it. Now, Prohibition in the early to mid 20th century was mostly fueled by the Protestant denominations in the southern United States, a region dominated by socially conservative evangelical Protestantism with a very high Christian church attendance. Now, generally, evangelical Protestant denominations encourage prohibition, while the mainline Protestant denominations disapproved of its introduction. Now, there were exceptions to this, such as the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, which is the German Confessional Lutherans, which is typically considered to be in scope of the evangelical Protestantism. Now, Pistic churches in the United States, especially Baptist churches, Methodists, Presbyterians, Congregationalists, and others in the evangelical tradition, sought to end drinking and the saloon culture during the third-party system. Little Gotical high churches, Catholic, Episcopal, German, Lutheran, and others in the mainland tradition would oppose prohibition laws because they did not want the government to reduce the definition of morality to a narrow standard or to criminalize the common liturgical practice of using wine. Revivalism during the Second Great Awakening and the Third Great Awakening in the mid to late 19th century set the stage for the bond between Pistic Protestantism and Prohibition in the United States. The greater prevalence of revival religion within a population, the greater support for the prohibition parties within that population. Historian Nancy Koester argued that prohibition was a victory for progressives and that social gospel activists battling poverty. Prohibition also united progressives and revivalists. Now, the temperance movement had popularized the belief that alcohol was the major cause of most personal and social problems, and prohibition was seen as the solution to the nation's poverty, crime, violence, and other ills. Upon ratification of the amendment, the evangelist Billy Sunday said that the slums will soon be only a memory, who will turn our prisons into factories and our jails into storehouses and corn cribs. This reportedly did happen on a very limited scale in the years after Iowa became a dry state in 1916. One Iowa town, Buck Grove, turned his jail into a tool house, while another sold its jail to a farmer. A prominent effect of prohibition was the nearly total destruction of the liquor market. The public believed that prohibition would be permanent, especially since there had never been a constitutional amendment that hadn't persisted. Preceding events suggested that the federal government would put a limit on how much alcohol content drinks could have, or how much a person could consume, but eventually Congress unreservedly outlawed liquor. The Volstead Act and the 18th Amendment together made it nearly impossible to distribute liquor or even possess drinks with more than 0.5% alcohol by volume. Now, though the government did introduce conditions that would help the transition to occur more smoothly, it was not enough. It was thought that eliminating the legal manufacture and sale of alcohol drink would solve the major social and economic problems of American society. The prohibition was opposed by a diverse group before it went into effect. Bootlegging, the process of making illegal alcohol beverages, quickly sprang up throughout the United States. Now, many would participate in these practices. On the contrary, many individuals also decided to abide by the new radical laws. Some positive changes did come from prohibition in the United States, but acceptance was not widespread enough to merit the challenges that the country faced. Due to the economic crashes caused by prohibition, entire industries were shattered by the loss of trade routes, and investors creating the demand for alcoholic drinks that severely outranked the supply. The effect was that more and more strong liquors were produced and distributed by bootleggers. Consequently, the government had to find a way to increase enforcement and regulation, but was faced with limited funding already, especially with the loss of tax revenue coming from the sale of liquor. Now, these challenges led the government to try some more treacherous methods. Now, prohibition enforcement mainly consisted of cutting off supply through smuggling and illegal manufacturing of alcoholic products. The government was highly effective at preventing alcohol from entering the country illegally, but bootleggers found a way around this by stealing or making deals to acquire industrial alcohol from factories that made ink, cleaning chemicals, fuels, adhesives, and various other products. Now, bootleggers were able to cut out the long process of fermentation to make alcohol, but instead they combined the industrial alcohol with their customary flavorings to make alcoholic beverages in a more efficient process. Subsequently, they made more money and were able to meet the high demand for the products. Now, the Volstead Act legislation to enforce the 18th Amendment carried out countermeasures for this practice. The United States federal government poisoned alcohol during Prohibition so that people would end up dying from drinking it. Now, there are various perspectives about what steps the government took and how far they went with this plan. Now, USA Today stated that the government went to unethical lengths to prevent alcohol consumption. However, this source does not agree that the government directly poisoned drinking alcohol, but instead it claims that the government indirectly poisoned citizens by denaturing industrial alcohol meant for manufacturing. Others believe that Congress hired chemists to combat the bootleggers who were using stolen industrial alcohol to make moonshine and other drinks. Now, factories were obligated by law to denaturate their alcohol to denature their alcohol. So they were told to denature their alcohol with chemicals that made it difficult to drink safely. Now, in return, bootleggers paid off to federal chemists and hired their own to neutralize the toxins in the alcohol. Eventually, the lack of obedience to the laws of prohibition frustrated the government, and the government invested more. They invested more in their scientific process, creating new blends to increase the toxicity of the chemicals in the industrial alcohol. And here's a picture of bootlegging equipment, and this is what was used to bootleg to make liquor that even though it was illegal to do so. Now, the federal government eventually found a denaturating formula that bootleggers were unable to work around. Though they would add a large amount of methyl alcohol at the time, there was no reliable method to completely detoxifying it. Now, soon after, the Treasury Department, under the direction of President Calvin Coolidge and Congress, they mandated that industrial alcohol contain their newly discovered blend. Illicit beverages became very lethal, even with the efforts of bootlegger chemists to remove the threat. A very small amount of undiluted methyl alcohol could kill a human being, and the effects were quickly realized. In 1926, New York City, 585 people died from this government action. Over 5,000 fatalities from this poisoning and at least a 600% increase from the previous deaths from alcohol were said to have resulted in this entire country. Now, before the government started this process, bootleggers were already making alcoholic beverages unsafe for the public. These illicit liquor manufacturers found that by adding some questionable ingredients, they could stimulate certain types and they can stimulate certain types of beverages. They had enjoyed before Prohibition to create entirely new flavors. Some bootleggers added dead rats to their moonshine to make their alcohol taste like bourbon. Others used tar and oil from trees to replace gin and scotch. Contraband beer or wine was fairly easy to come by, but unlike these new drinks, concocting these flavors increased demand for their products. However, these practices made it very unhealthy to drink illegal alcohol. Many doctors saw frequent visits from those who became sick from drinking. On the right here is a temperance fountain erected by the Women's Christian Temperance Union during the Prohibition era in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware. According to a 2010 review in the Economic Research on Prohibition, on balance, Prohibition probably reduced per capita alcohol use and alcohol-related harm, but these benefits eroded over time as an organized black market developed, and that public support for Prohibition declined. One study reviewing city-level drunkenness arrests concluded that Prohibition had an immediate effect, but no long-term effect. Now, another study examining mortality, mental health, and crime statistics found that alcohol consumption fell at first approximately to 30% of its pre-Prohibition level, but over but over the next several years, and increased to about 60 to 70% of its previous level. The 18th Amendment prohibited the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating beverages. However, it did not outlaw the possession or consumption of alcohol in the United States, which would allow legal loopholes for consumers to possess alcohol. Now here's a writing tablet pad for the prescription for the prescription of Prohibition era whiskey. Now, research indicates that the rates of cirrhosis of the liver declined significantly during Prohibition and increased after Prohibition's repeal. According to the historian Jack S. Blocker Jr., death rates from the cirrhosis and alcoholism, alcohol psychosis, hospital admissions, and drunkenness arrest all declined steeply during the latter years of the 1900s, when both the cultural and the legal climate were increasingly inhospitable to drink, and in the early years after national prohibition went into effect. Studies examining the rates of cirrhosis deaths as a proxy for alcohol consumption estimated a decrease in the consumption by 10 to 20%. National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism studies show clear epidemiological evidence that overall cirrhosis mortality rates had declined precipitously with the introduction of prohibition. Despite widespread flouting of the law, a 2024 study which used variations in state legality of alcohol found that individuals born in the 1930s in wet states had a higher later life mortality rate than those in any dry states. And this suggested adverse effects from in utero exposure to alcohol, which is why a lot of women were against drinking it, because they believed it could damage their uterus. Now, it's difficult to draw conclusions about Prohibition's effect on crime at the national level, as there were no uniform national statistics gathered about crime prior to 1930. But it's been argued throughout the years that organized crime received a major boost from Prohibition. For example, one study found that organized crime in Chicago tripled during Prohibition. Local criminal organizations had mostly limited their activities to prostitution, gambling, and theft, until 1920, when organized rum running or bootlegging emerged in response to Prohibition, because a new, highly profitable black market for alcohol had emerged. Now, Prohibition provided a financial basis for organized crime to flourish. Now, in one study of more than 30 major U.S. cities during the Prohibition years of 1920 and 1921, the number of crimes increased by 24%. Additionally, theft and burglaries increased by 9%, homicide rates by 13%, assaults and battery rose by 13%, and drug addiction by 45%. And police department costs rose by 11%. This was largely the result of the black market violence and the diversion of law enforcement resources everywhere. Despite the prohibition movement's hope that outlawing alcohol would reduce crime, the reality was that the Volstead Act led to higher crime rates than they were experienced prior to prohibition, and the establishment of a black market that was dominated by criminal organizations. A 2016 paper showed that South Carolina counties that enacted and enforced prohibition had homicide rates that increased by about 30 to 60% relative to counties that did not enforce prohibition. A 2009 study found an increase in homicides in Chicago during Prohibition. However, some scholars have attributed the crime during the Prohibition era to increased urbanization rather than the criminalization of alcohol use in general. But in some cities, such as New York City, crime rates decreased during the Prohibition era. Crime rates overall declined from the period of 1849 to 1951, making this decrease in crime during the Prohibition period less likely to be attributed to the criminalization of alcohol use. Mark H. Moore claims that, contrary to popular opinion, violent crime did not increase dramatically during Prohibition, and that organized crime existed before and after Prohibition. The historian Kenneth D. Rose corroborates historian John Burnham's assertion that during the 1920s there was no firm evidence of the supposed upsurge in lawlessness, as no statistics from this period dealing with crime are of any value whatsoever. California State University Chico historian Kenneth D. Rose writes, opponents of prohibition were fond of claiming that the Great Experiment had created a gangster element that had unleashed a crime wave on a hapless America. Miss Coppen Van Rensselaer, for instance, insisted in 1932 that the alarming crime wave, which had been piling up to unprecedented height, was a legacy of Prohibition. But Prohibition could hardly be held responsible for inventing crime, and while supplying illegal liquor proved to be lucrative, it was only an additional source of income to the more traditional criminal activities of gambling, loan sharking, racketeering, and prostitution. The notion of the Prohibition-induced crime wave, despite its popularity during the 1920s, cannot be substantiated with any accuracy because of the inadequacy of records kept by local police departments. Along with other economic effects, the enactment and enforcement of Prohibition caused an increase in resource costs. During the 1920s, the annual budget of the Bureau of Prohibition went from $4.4 million to $13.4 million. Additionally, the U.S. Coast Guard spent an average of $13 million annually on enforcement of the Prohibition laws. But these numbers do not take into account the cost to local and state governments. According to Harvard University historian Lisa McGeer, Prohibition led to an expansion in the powers of the federal government, federal state, basically, as well as as it helped shape the penal state. According to economic Colin Auger, Prohibition specifically increased the usage of telephone wiretapping by federal agents for evidence collection. According to Harvard University historian Lisa, sorry, I just read that one. Did I? Oh, no, okay, no, that's a different one. So according to Harvard, so this is discrimination. So according to Harvard University historian Lisa McGeer, Prohibition had a disproportionately adverse effect on African Americans, immigrants, and poor whites as law enforcement used alcohol prohibition against these communities. Now, different metrics have led to different assessments of the Prohibition's impact on the U.S. economy. Sources describe negative fiscal effects with loss of tax revenue and increased enforcement costs and economic impact on the regulated and adjacent and the adjacent industries. Now, Prohibition would cause the loss of at least $226 million per annual in tax revenues on liquor sales alone. Supporters of the Prohibition expected an increase in the sales of non-alcoholic beverages to replace the money trade from alcohol sales. But this did not happen. Prohibition caused the shutdown of over 200 distilleries, 1,000 breweries, and over 170,000 liquor stores. But it's worth noting that the amount of money used to enforce Prohibition started at $6.3 million in 1921, and it would rise to $13.4 million in 1930, almost doubling the original amount. A 2015 study estimated that the repeal of Prohibition had a net social benefit of $432 million per annual between the years of 1934 and 1937. About 0.33% of the gross domestic product. Total benefits of 3.25 billion consist primarily of increased consumer and producer supply, and the tax revenues and the reduced criminal violence costs. When 3.2% alcohol beer was legalized in 1933, it would create 81,000 jobs within a 3-month span. However, a 2021 study in the Journal of Economic History found that counties that adopted Prohibition early had greater population growth and an increase in farm real estate values. During the Prohibition era, rates of absenteeism decreased from 10% to 3%. In Michigan, the Ford Motor Company documented a decrease in the absenteeism from 2,620 in April of 1918 to 1,628 in May of 1918. And here are men and women drinking beer at a bar in Braceland, Louisiana, in September of 1938, where pre-prohibition saloons were mostly male establishments, and post-prohibition bars catered to both males and females. As saloons would die out, public drinking lost much of its macho connotation, resulting in increased social acceptance of women drinking in the semi-public environment of the speakeasies. This new norm established women as notable new target demographic for alcohol marketers who sought to expand their clientele. Women thus found their way into the bootlegging business, with some discovering that they could make a living by selling alcohol with minimal likelihood of suspicion by the law enforcement. Before Prohibition, women who drank publicly in saloons or taverns, especially outside of urban centers like Chicago or New York, were seen as immoral, or they were likely to be prostitutes even if they weren't. Now, heavy drinkers and alcoholics were among the most affected groups during Prohibition. Now, those who were determined to find liquor could still do so, but those who saw their drinking habits as destructive typically had difficulty in finding the help that they sought. Self-help societies had withered away along with the alcohol industry. In 1935, a new self-help group called Alcoholics Anonymous, AA, was found. Now, Prohibition also had an effect on the music industry in the United States, especially when it came to jazz music. Speakeasies became very popular, and the Great Depression migratory effects led to the dispersal of jazz music from New Orleans going north through Chicago and to New York. Now, this would lead to the development of different styles in different cities due to its popularity in speakeasies and the emergence of advanced recording technology. Jazz's popularity skyrocketed. It was also the forefront of the minimal integration efforts going on at the time, as it united mostly black musicians with mostly white audience. A 2025 study linked prohibition of alcohol to increased coffee consumption in the United States. And even though I don't drink, I rarely drink alcohol, but I do drink coffee a lot. Now, making moonshine was an industry in the American South before and after Prohibition. In the 1950s, muscle cars became popular, and various roads became known as the Thunder Road for their use by moonshiners. A popular song was created, and the legendary drivers, cars, and routes were depicted in the film The Thunder Road, which I've never seen or heard of. As a result of Prohibition, the advancements of industrialization within the alcoholic beverage industry were essentially reversed. Large-scale alcohol producers were shut down for the most part, and some individual citizens took it upon themselves to produce alcohol illegally, essentially reversing the efficiency of mass producing and retailing alcoholic beverages. Closing the country's manufacturing plants and taverns also resulted in an economic downturn for the industry. Now, while the 18th Amendment did not have this effect on the industry due to its failure to define an intoxicating beverage, the Bolstead Act's definition of 0.5% or more alcohol by volume shut down the brewers. But they expected to continue to produce beer of moderate strength. In 1930, the Prohibition Commissioners estimated that in 1919, the year before the Bolstead Act became law, the average drinking American spent about $17 per year on alcoholic beverages, because back then it was cheap. By 1930, because enforcement diminished the supply, spending had increased to $35 per year. There was no inflation in this period because they didn't keep track of that back then. The result was an illegal alcoholic beverage industry that made an average of $3 billion per year in illegal untaxed income. Now, the Bolstead Act specifically allowed the individual farmers to make certain wines on the legal fiction that it was a non-intoxicating fruit juice for home consumption, and many did so. Enterprising grape farmers produce liquid and semi-solid grape concentrates, often called wine bricks or wine blocks. This demand led to California grape growers to increase their land under cultivation by about 700% during the first 5 years of Prohibition. Basically, so Wandering Gamer, the religious people managed to ban alcohol by completely citing religious reasons and stating that it was violent. So they believed that it was a sin to drink alcohol, and that if you drank alcohol, they believed you to become violent, which is not always the case either. Now, the grape concentrate was sold with a warning label. After dissolving the brick in a gallon of water, do not place the liquid in a jug away in the cupboard for 20 days, because then it would turn into wine. Now, the Volstead Act allowed the sale of sacramental wine to priests and ministers, and they allowed rabbis to approve sales of kosher wine to individuals for Sabbath and holiday use at home. Among the Jewish faith, four rabbinical groups were approved, which led to some competition for membership, and since the supervision of sacramental licenses could be used to secure donations to support a religious institution, there were known abuses in the system, with imposters or unauthorized agents using loopholes to purchase the wine. Now, Prohibition had a notable effect on the alcohol brewing industry in the United States. Wine historians noted that Prohibition destroyed what was a fledgling wine industry in the United States. Productive wine quality grapevines were replaced by lower quality vines that grew thicker and skinned grapes, which could be more easily transported, and much of the institutional knowledge was also lost as winemakers either immigrated to other wine-producing countries or left the business altogether. Now, distilled spirits became more popular during Prohibition because their alcohol content was higher than that of fermented wine and beer, and spirits were often diluted with non-alcoholic drinks. Now we have reached the end of our video, so you guys can tell me what you guys think, and make sure to smash that like and subscribe button for more videos for more history videos like this. There is one history video I'm going to put out, and it is going to cause some controversy, and it's about slavery. And it's about slavery, and I want to put that out there because even though I did not agree with slavery when it happened, even though it was before my time, I did not agree with the white people taking black people as slaves, and that was stupid of them to do so. But if you like the video, make sure to smash that like and subscribe for more videos like this. If you have any suggestions on videos for me to do, you can send them to me through chat messenger. Since I started my second job yesterday, I am going to be kind of busy for all next week. I have to figure out next week. I think I might have a video up on Saturday, because starting Monday, I'm going to be working 13-hour days. I'm going to be at my one job from 4 in the morning to 9, and then I'll come home, sleep for a little bit, and do my other job from 3 to midnight. Even I'm working 3 to midnight today, but starting Monday, I'm going to be doing my job from 4 to 9 in the morning, and then coming home, sleep for about 4 hours, and then get up, get dressed, and then go do my second job that starts at like 3 and goes to midnight. So that was not too bad. So I'm going to be working 65 hours a week, give or take. And that does not include finding time to do my YouTube videos and doing the part for that movie that I'm going to be doing next year. So next week, let's pull this up here. I still have to get to my World War II video. I think I did the first one, but I don't remember doing the second. Golden Age of Piracy, Slavery, Beaver Wars, that's another one. Scotland, Irish mythology, Ireland. I do want to do a video on Ireland because I am Irish, and what better way to dig into the roots of Ireland and figuring out what the country's about. So we will close out the Prohibition now, because we're done with that. And then we'll also talk about the women's suffrage and the Third Awakening and the Second Awakening. So I'll let you guys go so I can get ready for work for my second job. I'm doing laundry in between too, so I gotta check on my laundry, make sure that it's all good to go. So I'll let you guys go, and I'll probably be back next Saturday, because I'm working tomorrow at my one job that I do from 4 to 9 in the morning. They have a shift open tomorrow, so to make up for today of me not working, I'm gonna come in tomorrow and work that to make up my money for what I didn't work today in the morning. So I'll let you guys go, and I'll see you guys next week, possibly on Saturday.